So I think what we're going to do, we're going to ramble about old video games. And you know what? I've got a real treat for us. I'm going to pull up a video and we're going to talk about it. What a treat, huh? We are going to watch a brief video from some really awesome people that are much bigger than me, and they're way cool. So if somehow I'm somebody's first introduction to this channel, yeah, go check them out. Especially if you are like, oh, I like video games and video game news is like an industry. Definitely check them out. Okay, here we go. We have the one, the only, the react content. It didn't like it. Awesome. This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about retro games and preservation. Let's jump into it.
It turns out that the vast majority of video games no longer exist in any meaningful way. That might seem like an alarming statement. You might think, oh, surely you're just talking about ancient things. No, it's actually quite a bit worse than just about anybody thought.
Okay, little bit of context. We, as like a modern society, have already had an issue with preservation in other media forms, and they figured it out, right? So a ton of old movies, if I remember correctly, it's before the 1950s. Like 80% of films, like motion pictures made before 1950 are lost to time. Part of that was that there was like a vault fire, if I remember correctly. Like they were trying to preserve films and then a fire broke out in there and destroyed all of the motion pictures and films, right? So like that kind of stuff happens. What's great about the digital age is that that doesn't have to be something that we worry about anymore, because the amount of digital storage that we have in the world is insanity. We daily, the human species is creating more data today than like the last 1,000 years. It's insane how much data we A, create, and B, store, and the technology that we can use to make sure that that data is preserved is really awesome. Because when you had to write something down back, like we'll talk about before the Gutenberg press, if someone wrote something down, someone had to put the time and effort into writing it down. And I don't know if you Zoomers still have to do what is it, vocabulary quizzes and stuff in school. But back in my day, because I'm ancient now, we used to have to do vocabulary tests where we were quizzed on the spelling of words. So we'd have a vocabulary list of like 15 or 20 words, and we'd get that on Monday. And then on Friday, we'd have a quiz on if we could spell all those words correctly, right? I was horrible at those quizzes. But one of the exercises to get the vocabulary down was to just rewrite the words over and over. Like literally just like write the word 5 times, like 2 or 3 nights a week. So it's this huge list of, oh God, what's 5 times 15, 50, 75. So it's just a page of 75 words. That's just the same 15 words written 5 times over again. But that copying takes a lot of time. It kind of hurts your hand, and there can be mistakes. Like you might have a misspelling in one of those times that you rewrote it. So the way of creating information in a way that wasn't just relying on humans telling it to each other, which makes it more concrete, because when people tell things to each other, it changes a little bit over time, right? It's like the game of telephone. I don't know if you've ever played that game. It's where you sit in like a big circle and you whisper a word. Like one person comes up with a word and they whisper it into someone's ear, and it gets passed around the circle. And by the time it gets back to the person who originally said it, the word is like totally different. The same thing can happen with like oral traditions, is what it's called. So writing was a big deal. It took a lot of time, so it was really expensive. And when we talk about expensive, I'm not just talking about money, but like the resources that had to get invested into creating it, someone's time and someone's energy. So that was before the Gutenberg press. Gutenberg press comes out. That thing's really cool. You order a bunch of pieces of metal and then you cover it in ink and then you can stamp it down on pages over and over and over again. So you only have to do the labor of writing it one time and you get these blocks that you can then smash onto a piece of paper and it recreates it over and over again. So you're like multiplying, you're like exponentially increasing the availability of written work, right? So it's the Gutenberg press. We're talking like, oh God, when was the Gutenberg press invented? Oh, I'm going to look like a nerd. I'm going to guess late 1600s. Ooh, 1450. I was super off. Womp womp. Stay in school, kids. Anyway, Gutenberg press explodes the ability to disseminate information in the written way. It also explodes the necessity for people to know how to read, right? Because if there's basically no books, why do you need to know how to read, right? So when it comes to preservation, like we're creating more stuff than ever before, which is really cool and interesting. Video games have really only been around as like an art medium since, I mean, the computer was first invented in the 1950s, and even then it was only used in academic and government work. So creating art for these machines wasn't really a thing that people did for a while because it was only used during your job, and the time that it was available for you and your department to use was really valuable. So towards like completing the task that you were working on. So video games didn't really become a thing until computers could be used by more than one person at a time. Really popularized by the Unix operating system, which was basically having one big computer in a building. And then there's a ton of like they're called terminals connected up to it, which was a keyboard and a monitor so that you could use the computer, but while you're typing or while you're reading the output of what it put out, someone else could be doing work on the computer, having the processor do calculations. So that's like shared, I believe it's called distributed use or shared uptime, something like that. It's a really cool idea, especially when computers were very, very big. And that's why those first personal computers, like the IBM computer, IBM home personal computer, they were called microcomputers, or the BBC Micro. They were computers that were small enough to fit on your desk. And that was really small compared to what computers were typically, like the form factor that they took up. Really cool stuff. Video games. Back on topic. Video games as an art medium are very new, but we have not learned any of the lessons that other art mediums have learned in terms of the necessity and the value in preservation. And that's exactly what this is going to be talking about. That's a little bit of context. Let's continue watching the video. I'm going to pull us back like 5 seconds.
Meaningful way. That might seem like an alarming statement. You might think, oh, surely you're just talking about ancient things. No, it's actually quite a bit worse than just about anybody thought. Yeah. The headline stat is that 87% of games released before 2010 are unavailable to anyone. This is thanks to the Video Games History Foundation, where that is actually what they found. And across the medium's history, less than 20% of games in any given generation are actually preserved.
That's crazy if you think about it. So when they talk about how 87% of games aren't preserved, they mean that they're not purchasable today. Without going on another multi-minute long tangent, what we're talking about when we talk about games preservation is the ability for people to legally obtain and engage with the material, right? So piracy is not a way of preserving these games as we're talking about it inside of this discussion. If we're taking a step back and zooming out a little bit, then yes, piracy is a form of preservation because the media is not truly lost. It's not gone forever. It's not extinct anymore. It still exists and can be shared. The problem is that it can't legally be shared, right? And that's a really important factor, especially when you're talking about video games as an academic like topic, right? Because now if you're trying to put together a course on like the history of 3D video games, there are games that can't be a part of that curriculum because there's no legal way to obtain a copy for the students to play, right? So in this discussion, it's not just whether the ones and zeros still exist in that order. It's also about access. Okay, and that's what this organization is talking about. They're talking about legal access.
This is a chart that shows how many games are actually easily accessible to an audience in any of these given eras.
I'm assuming that easily accessible means legally obtainable. Just a little assumption there.
You can see that very early on there's obviously problems, but it's certainly not like these stats have got better. I mean, from years 1985 to 1994, you have more availability than like 1995 to 2004.
Isn't that crazy? The games made from 1990 to 1994, I believe that's the end of the Nintendo Entertainment System. 1994 video game console generation. The Neo Geo, which was a way for... Oh God, what video game company is it? Oh gosh, I'm gonna get embarrassed. The Neo Geo was a way for SNK to bring their arcade games like Metal Slug, King of Fighters, that kind of stuff to home audiences. And they used very similar technologies, like they used the same ROM chips. It was on a different cartridge though. And so you could bring your saves and your high scores from the home to the arcade, which was really cool. But it was also a way for you to play the arcade games at home. It was very expensive, really cool platform. 1990 in Japan, Europe, I'm assuming we're going to count for the sake of just looking at this here quickly, Europe also being the United States release. So 94, the Neo Geo first comes out in the US. The Super Famicom is 1992. So the first 2 years of the Super Nintendo being available, any of the games made in those first 2 years of the Super Nintendo being out have a better chance of being legally obtainable than games from the Nintendo 64. That's crazy if you think about it. That's crazy. Why did it get worse? That's a rhetorical question. We're going to talk about that.
Which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And what this means is fairly obvious. Unless there's a profit to be made for it, they don't really give a shit.
There's the answer to the rhetorical question. Anyway, continuing on.
And it's kind of fundamentally different to how things are actually working out in other mediums. And I think this is what was really, for me, the bit that made me feel it, what actually sent it home. Compared to studies of other creative mediums, the availability rate of pre-2010 video games, 13%, is similar to the commercial availability of pre-World War II audio recordings, 10% or less, or the survival rate of American silent era films, 14%. So in preservation terms,
depressing.
That means that a medium that has existed entirely within the span of the last 60 years has got similar preservation problems compared to things that existed 100 plus years ago from the present day. And in a way it does.
That's horrible.
Because most of the games that are not commercially popular end up being stuck behind technical limitations where there's just not enough modders to fix the problem. There's no drive to restore these kind of old mid-tier 7 out of 10 games for modern audiences. Yet, if you want to play Tetris or Pong or whatever, even the most original version, you can, because those have shown their popularity. But here's an interesting example of it. Let's just say you played a small little indie game called Elden Ring, and you thought, where did that company come from? And you found out that their first title is a game called King's Field. There's a sequel that is also named King's Field in the English version. This
We love when game companies name 2 different games the same name. It happens. It's just funny. Excuse me for 1 minute. There we go. Distraction over.
This is now
Great job,
unavailable from
FromSoft.
any source other than going through full ROM emulation.
It's not legally playable, is what that answer is. There's no legal way for you to have just heard about this and now go play it. And that's tragic.
And I think that example is ultimately this sort of point wrote large, right? Where a lot of games that are actually important to the medium, that allow audiences to understand the growth and the development of games as an art form, are just not accessible in any real way.
Right. And that's important. And I think that they did a really good job pulling the developer from software, because Elden Ring was huge. It did Call of Duty numbers in a game with 0 microtransactions. That's huge. That's a big deal.
And some of them are cultural juggernauts, right? I mean, what about games that provide like context for a culture? A really good example then is the Commodore 64, right? That is spoken of in this study as an abandoned ecosystem with...
So the Commodore 64, for the really young ones that don't know what that is, the Commodore 64 was a very popular home computer system. If I remember correctly, the Commodore 64 could run DOS operating system. It could run DOS, Commodore Kernel Basic. That's right, Commodore Kernel Basic. So the Commodore 64 was one of the really popular, really accessible home computers early in the expansion of home computing and video games. If I remember correctly, it came out in the late 70s. Oh, early 80s. Rats. Early 80s. It came out in the early 80s. And it's a really important platform. It's kind of like when we talk about PC gaming now, we talk about it on a Windows operating system for the most part, because that's what most games are released for. A lot of games in the early 1980s were released for the Commodore. The 1980s is during the decline of the video game market in America and Europe, partially due to some interactions in the Atari platform market. Do you guys remember like the Nintendo Wii, how there were just like really horrible games in like the dollar bin at the Walmart? They were kind of colloquially called shovelware. And so there were a lot of low quality games on the market for the Atari platforms and other home entertainment platforms at the time that was really eroding consumer confidence in the medium, because you'd go to buy a game and they were really expensive and then they'd be really horrible. Not dissimilar to a lot of the sentiment that we hold today with how games being released aren't finished. And that's really frustrating. This happened before. It was the Nintendo Entertainment System that revitalized the video game market, and it was through their Nintendo seal of approval. Because to be on the Nintendo platform, to be released as a game on Nintendo, it had to be approved for the platform by Nintendo. So there was a curation to the games that were available. And so those high prices were not scaring off customers anymore, because they knew that the game was at least going to work, right? And that it was probably going to be pretty good. And so Nintendo really rescued the video game market in the 1980s with the Famicom in Japan, the Nintendo Entertainment System abroad. But yeah, the Commodore 64 was like the PC gaming platform compared to the home console thing of like Atari, Nintendo, Magnavox Odyssey, that kind of stuff.
Less than 4.5% of the Commodore 64's total game library ever being made available again.
Oh, that's rough. That's really rough.
3.375% of that total library came from one company dedicated to reissuing those games.
Of the 4.5%, 3.4% was one company. I feel like that really shows that this isn't a problem. This isn't a technology problem. This isn't a problem of means. There's no way to do it. This is a problem of the companies. It's up to them and they don't care. Simple as.
Games. One company. Without them, what would that number look like? It would be
1.1. It would be 1.1 without them.
Absolutely minuscule. And what's shocking is if you thought this was only happening to absolute ancient games that you could almost call boomer games and be right, no, it's not that. Because the digital era has actually not done a lot to change this problem.
It's arguably set back a lot of the progress that was being made.
Which is really the bit that shocked me. Games released from 2005 to 2009, so the beginning of the era of digital distribution.
2005 to 2009. I believe that's the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Yeah, 7th generation. That is the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. That's right. First motion gaming era. That's right, with the Nintendo Wii and PlayStation came out with their motion controller, and Xbox came out the Kinect. Oh man, what a time.
Maybe your Xbox Live Arcade, that kind of thing. They showed no major increase in availability over earlier periods, suggesting that digitally distributed games may fall out of release as easily as other formats.
We saw that recently with the closure of the 3DS and Wii U eShops. Which is why it was such a big deal that Gerard the Completionist put the effort, and it took months, if not, I think it took longer than a year for him to do the physical act of making sure that every single digital game was purchased, because there was no way to do bulk purchases and you couldn't do it through an internet browser. You had to do it on device. And those download speeds were really slow on those devices. So I believe it took over a year for him to purchase all of those games. But that's why it's such a big deal, because without knowing that there's one person who did all of it, there's no guarantee that a copy of any one of those games exists on a device still. And the next step of that is that even if it does exist on a device, what if that device is broken? If the device becomes broken over time through being in someone's closet, through being in a storage container, and like a storage. Oh God, what are they called? They do the Storage Wars TV show about them. The storage locker. Yeah, like they just like shove it in the thing, and then a flood happens, and now it's broken. If that was the only person with a copy of it, it's just gone now. It's just gone. How is that okay?
Yep, so without there even being a form of physical media where you can just make a game appear in a hard drive, still not actually turning out well. So actually that's a lot of modern games just vanishing into the ether. These are games that people currently working in the industry actually have credits on.
That's really weird to think about. I know that as younger people still engaged with like the academic world and not necessarily as like working professionals, it's hard to think of what you've worked on as something that will continue to exist. I know that I personally have most of my school stuff saved onto a cloud storage account, right? So it exists on this computer, it exists on my laptop, and from time to time it exists on either my phone or an iPad. But most importantly, even if all of those devices were to break all at the same time, they exist on a company's devices. God bless Dropbox. But, you know, I don't believe, like, essays that I wrote by hand exist anymore for, like, middle school and high school. They just don't exist anymore. They got thrown away. They're gone. And even when we turn in really big projects, I know that a lot of classes will have, like, like your final project be like a YouTube video or something. And that still exists for as long as YouTube is willing to host it. And that's really cool. But like, we never go back to it. But when your job is to make video games and you're still working in the industry, like you have a portfolio that you can show, but some of the games that they worked on do not exist anymore. They have their portfolio. They have, like, they can say that they worked on it, but even if they appear in the credits of the game, once you beat the game and the credits roll, even if their name is on there, which there was a whole thing about making people not use their legal names in the credits in video games from like the early 80s to the mid 90s, so that they couldn't get hired by other companies to work on games because the production companies were abusing their powers and making sure that their employees couldn't go work other places. Whole other story. You know, there's no proof that they did it, right? You have on your portfolio that like you worked on that game, but it doesn't exist anymore, and there's not really a way to verify it, so they can't even see what you did, what you're claiming to have done. Like that's crazy. That's crazy.
And now I'd say consider the impact of digital storefronts. I think one digital storefront is the Xbox Live Arcade. I mean, if you're around my age, you'll probably remember Xbox Live Arcade. There's a lot of stuff there that is just gone, right? That's how it's ultimately going to end up being. And we actually covered this decently recently with the closure of the 8th gen stores in the past, where the PlayStation stores on the Vita and PS3, they were supposed to close. And then public outcry actually stopped that, gave it a stay of execution. And in theory, that does mean that hundreds of legacy games were preserved, right? Like 266 PS1, 104 PS2, 304 PSP games. And like the PSP is surprisingly beloved by its like more dedicated fan base. Same for the Vita as well.
They're really cool. They're really cool machines. If you jailbreak them, if you mod them, give them modified firmware. The Vita is like a way for you to play every PlayStation game that's ever existed. It can be really cool.
Which is a console well ahead of its time. I mean, hey, even sporting an OLED screen all the way back then.
But way cool.
Actually, the study found that because of a bug with PlayStation Network accounts, no newly created accounts could actually access content on a PS3 or Vita without a community solution or workaround. And that does mean that as many as 674 PlayStation games reissued in North America may have actually fallen back out of release. And then moving to the Wii U and 3DS and their stores being shut down, the March 2023 closure meant that 121 Game Boy titles were removed from active distribution.
That's the Nintendo Game Boy. That was like, that created the handheld gaming market. That created it. That created the whole idea of like handheld gaming. And those games are just gone now. Well, I take that back. They're not gone. They're not legally obtainable.
Entirely. And that does mean that within the Game Boy family, there's almost no retained games. And like, that's the Game Boy, one of the most significant pieces of gaming hardware in history. And this shouldn't exactly be a surprise, because with a lack of physical copies that exist for preservation, digital stuff is just as susceptible to falling out of availability. I'd almost say that it's more susceptible to falling out of availability. And that does mean, I think, with all these stores, there is a little bit of a ticking time bomb.
We talked about that. And exactly, I agree, 100%.
I mean, hell, even for more recent things, like we've covered so many instances of companies like just delisting their games from Steam as an example because they're no longer commercially viable.
We have that same issue when it comes to television and movies with streaming services like Disney Plus, HBO. It was I know on Disney Plus, the Mysterious Benedict Society isn't available anymore. They pulled it because not enough people were watching it or something, and they wanted to show that it was a loss on their taxes. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess, and it's really screwed up that those are the reasons that these things aren't available anymore in the digital age, when it costs functionally nothing to have that thing available, right? Because like if it has to sit on a store shelf, like someone has to pay rent for that building to exist, and you know, physical space is finite and it's valuable, but digital space is functionally infinite. Yes, of course, there's the cost of keeping servers maintained and electricity bills and da 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 da, but the systems that we've built make it so that all of that is existing. Like it's almost like a road at this point, right? Like it's made and we're all using it, and so it's weird to factor that into the cost of getting something somewhere, right? So like it's functionally free to do that, and they don't do that. They just don't do it.
A lot of people seem to be feeling this as well with a lot of the big streaming services, which seemingly, I don't
There, yeah, see, streaming services. Yeah, there we go. We're on exactly the same page.
know if it's to skimp on royalties or like have a better, tax write-off or something, but a lot of TV shows and movies just being pulled from streaming services in a way that feels just like really quick and kind of mercenary to a lot of people. That's actually shaking, I think it really is shaking actually some people's confidence in the sustainability of like that medium.
This is what happened leading up to the Nintendo Entertainment System. History is a flat circle.
But anyway, that's why there's a really good tracking website called Delisted Games, where their owner was actually forced to seek support from interested parties, and they admitted in June that, quote, after 7 years of chronicling the comings and goings of game services, storefronts, and entire platforms, I am no longer able to keep up as more delistings and shutdowns seemingly happen every day. And it's because, like, me and
That's so depressing. That someone keeping a repository of what games are no longer available, they can't keep up with it. They can't keep up with the amount of art that's being just like Thanos snapped from existence. Like they can't keep up with it anymore. There's too much of it happening. We're losing this stuff faster than one person can keep track of it.
you are playing, generally speaking, decently modern contemporary games, or maybe if they're older games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike, you could almost call them like forever games. Isn't it crazy that we haven't noticed that? I don't think I've noticed that. I don't think you've noticed that. It's a bit like how, when the geologists and the I don't know, paleontologists and stuff, they look in the fossil record and they see these like massive extinction events. And to us, they seem so unbelievably calamitous. But then you remember, oh wait, we're actually living in a mass extinction event literally right now.
To living creatures. We're living through one of those right now. Oh.
We just don't notice it. And it's a little bit like that, I think, with video games. I mean, probably a bit less important with video games, but
absolutely less important. 1,000% less important. And alongside that, it's really interesting because these are our own creations that we're doing this to. There's a thing that, like, when I was growing up, like, adults always used to say to me, like, oh, you're never going to take care of something as good as you take care of your own stuff, right? Like when the schools hand out laptops and Chromebooks and stuff like that to the students, they just trash them because if it's not yours, you don't take as good care of it. The video games are ours. All of this art is ours. It's all ours. And we're still trashing it. We're completely disrespecting it. We give it zero respect. We give it zero love, and it's our own stuff. No wonder we're like these mass extinction events are happening to like living creatures, and we're not doing anything about it. It's when like we have the ability, we have like the moral like obligation to, and we aren't. And we're doing it to our own art, our own creations, the stuff that we are making. It's, oh man.
but still something that is kind of shocking. Like a little, it's just bad. And that brings us to the likes of VGHF and other grassroots organizations that are basically realizing this is a problem, thinking, feck, we need to solve this. Even we have a recent one with NoClip. Right? NoClip, Danny O'Dwyer, they got a big old haul of marketing tapes that helped track the history of games via trailers, gameplay capture, and never before seen press releases and press previews.
Really cool stuff. That's really cool stuff.
Of games. And I know there's a channel, it was called, I think it's called Gamers, but it's spelt funny with like a V in it or something, and they do these sort of documentaries. And I forget what it was, but it was just like archival footage of like E3 demos that are just basically impossible to find. They just have these entire, you know, a company did this for 3 years, it didn't work out, Sony canceled the project, but actually look at a full game that could have happened. And it's just fascinating. Yet we're kind of robbed of all that because we obviously cannot rely on corporations to
Wow. That's kind of heavy.
to handle things like this. I mean, as an example, here in Northern Ireland, there's a group NI Screen, and I'm sure you have a version in your region as well. I mean, how many TV shows have the big Georgia peach at the start because the state of Georgia's given them some money, or maybe a comedy group working with Screen Australia or something. So one of the things Northern Ireland Screen does is an archival project. Like archival footage of like, what did Belfast look like in 1900? Well, they find the footage, they archive it, and then that can be like licensed out to people. But there's kind of nobody doing any of that. That's
really cool.
Because it's not really, I think, by a lot of those traditional power structures, treated as being important to the degree where we need a form of preservation that does not involve a commercial interest.
But video games as an industry is larger than movies today in terms of dollars and in terms of workers. I mean, like, correct me down in the comments, put a source or whatever, but like...
And I think that's the thing that's kind of interesting. And it's where Embracer Group have been particularly fascinating. Now, I think some of Embracer's recent problems, like, could put this in jeopardy, could be a bit worrying, but they're basically trying to make the gaming equivalent of the seed vault in Svalbard. If you're not aware of that, there's like a big vault in Svalbard that has just all the seeds. All the seeds that we can find, all the different species of seed, they're there in the big seed vault for, I guess, science and the future. We don't really have that for games. But of course, it actually gets a little bit worse for games.
Look at all those demo kiosks! Dude! Dude, look at them! Look at them! Oh my gosh! Oh, that's so cool! Oh, man. If you young people never got the opportunity to play at those little demo kiosks, oh man. I know I've still seen them exist at I've seen one at Target. I've seen it at Target, and it's a Nintendo Switch like demo kiosk thing, and you can like play with the controllers and stuff. Dude, these things used to be like everywhere. I remember, oh god, they had them like rotating at the GameStop. Dude, at the Walmart over where they had games, they would have these things, and the TVs were like 7-8 feet up, right? They're like at the top of the shelves. And so you're sitting there, the controller is kid height, you know, it's like 3 feet off the ground, and then they'd have another one that's like 4 feet off the ground. But like you'd be craning your neck. You'd be craning your neck, like staring at the ceiling, trying to play this game demo with a controller that hundreds, thousands of other people have touched. So it's nasty, and there's stick drift, and the buttons don't work right. And you're just trying to play the demo of this really cool game because you only have enough money to buy like 2 or 3 games a year if you're super lucky. And so like you're trying to figure out which one you want to get. Oh, dude, what a time. What a time.
And this is stuff that I believe even the ESA have lobbied against, which I think is truly quite awful. So, should you be able to go to a library or reach out to a preservation group and get access to a library copy of a video game? Let's say that you are interested in you're interested in cultural history of whatever, right? And as part of your project, you want to find some video game, it's out of print, And in the same way you could go to like the big library in London to find some ancient book, should you be able to do that with a video game? Most of us would say yes, because
yeah, definitely. Also, we're gonna flip the webcam just a little bit. We're gonna flip it. Don't even worry about it. Now we're watching it together. But now this is my right hand. Oh, okay. All right. I just need to not look at myself too much. Okay, back to the topic at hand. Yes, library copies of video games. Yep.
that's good. It doesn't have to involve a whole bunch of money. It can still just be good. And that's not all that different to say classic books, classic movies, and of course, digital files. I mean, you can borrow ebooks, you can borrow films in a digital fashion. Now, if that was the case with video games, you could research how developers did something specific with a game mechanic in the 80s.
Absolutely. This is a big thing with Nintendo's Mode 7. It was a really cool effect that you could do on the Super Nintendo, and it didn't even need a special fancy chip. Mode 7. Here we go. So it was a way that you could essentially lay a tile like flat, and then you could transform it, which gave the illusion of 3D. So that allows a background layer to be rotated and scaled on a scanline by scanline basis to create many different depth effects. Yes. Most famous of these effects is an application of a perspective effect on a background layer by scaling and rotating the background layer in this manner. Right, so here's the math. Woohoo! 2D matrix notation, let's go! I want to see if I can, Mode 7, Final Fantasy 6. It was called Final Fantasy 3 in North America and Europe, don't worry about it. Yeah! That's what's up. Nobuo Uematsu. Man, what a guy. What a composer. You gonna show me some Mode 7? Show me some good old-fashioned Mode 7? Show me Mode 7. Yeah, Mode 7! Okay, there you go. That's Mode 7. Also, wait, we're gonna go back like 2 seconds. Nobuo Uematsu. Yeah, that's the guy. He's doing the music right now. Oh, man, what a composer. Yeah, so Mode 7, look at this. So this tundra that they're walking across, right, is a flat 2D tile, like a JPEG, right? But because you can modify it scanline by scanline, so row by row, you can make it look like it's 3D, like they're walking across it, right? Because these mechs are a 2D flat sprite, and they're walking across the ground, which is also just a 2D flat sprite, but they're modifying it scanline by scanline, which creates the illusion, the way our eyes work, to look like they're walking across it, when really they're just doing a walking in place animation. And if Mode 7 wasn't here, it would look like it's just scrolling down, right? It would look like they're climbing it. But it's the same effect that the Star Wars intro, the title scroll has, right? And that's the Mode 7 effect on the Super Nintendo. There's also, yeah, here's the other cool Mode 7. So this is really showing off the power of Mode 7. Look at the way that they're flying around the world, and they're doing it in 3 dimensions. Look, they're rotating, they're getting closer and farther. If you look in the bottom right corner, there, the little red dot, right? Flying around the map, and you can tell the orientation because there's a big red dot and a little red dot to show kind of the orientation. So that's the power of Mode 7, is you get this 3D effect. And look at how fast it's going. That's quick, especially because this doesn't have a Super Effects chip in it. The Super Effects chip was what they used to make Star Fox on the original Super Nintendo. It was it's a extra processing power to be able to do 3D vector-based 3D animation and polygons. Right. This is all just sprite and tile manipulation at a 2D layer. None of this is actually 3D. It's a 3D effect. It's a 3D illusion. Really cool stuff. Anyway, that's Mode 7, but there's not really a legal way for you to go back and play that. Square Enix has gone and made the Pixel remasters, but those are they're a Windows game. They're a .exe. They're not a ROM to run on an emulator. It's a complete port, so it's not using Mode 7 stuff to pull off the effect. I don't know exactly how they do it for the Pixel remaster, but it's not Mode 7 because it's not on a Super Nintendo. So there you go.
Maybe find a copy of something that was created by a company that's now buried in 5 layers of corporate acquisition, right?
Ravensoft, fucking Rare, Crystal Dynamics, Activision Blizzard King, literally right now. Who do they belong to? Do they belong to themselves? Do they belong to Microsoft? That's actively being litigated right now. So
a corporate angle, a constant if tiny stream of like revenue.
We should go back in time a little bit. I forgot what they were talking about.
Would say yes, because that's
library games. Yes.
Involve a whole bunch of money. It can still just be good. And that's not all that different to say classic books, classic movies.
Frankenstein, Fahrenheit 451, George Orwell's 1984, Pride and Prejudice, all this stuff, right?
And of course, digital files. I mean, you can borrow ebooks, you can borrow films in a digital fashion.
That there is a legal framework for that, by the way. Totally a thing. Totally a thing.
Now, if that was the case with video games, you could research how developers did something specific with a game mechanic.
Let me give me 1 second, folks. Give me 1 second. I want to show you something, but I want to make sure that I don't like leak a password or something. You know what I mean? The Libby app. This is an ebook that I've been listening to recently. Right? This is an ebook that I'm borrowing through an application called Libby. I have it on my phone, and they have this desktop app, right? It's just a browser. It's just a website that you go to, but it's called Libby, and I'm renting this ebook to read. I can also do it with like with EPUBs or basically like PDFs, right? So an ebook version of the written text. I could also do that for some of these books, but audiobooks because I'm a millennial, I guess. Anyway, yeah, totally a thing you can do, totally a thing that exists. Please, 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 if you don't already, go get a library card. Go get a library card. Wherever you live, whatever town, whatever city you live in, go get a library card. It's really easy if you have government ID, like a driver's license or a state ID. And if you're under 18, I don't remember what the process looks like. But yeah, it's like super, super easy. Go get a library card. Libraries are funded in part by the number of members that they have to the library. So go be a part of your library, read more books, listen to audiobooks. Don't rely on Netflix and Hulu. Don't let them trick you into thinking that you need to spend $15 a month to be able to access like good media. Your library has DVDs. Your library has stuff for you to watch, stuff for you to listen to, stuff for you to read. Your library has it. And my local library, super cool. They even have a seed library. So if I wanted to like grow some tomatoes or something, I could go to my library and get tomato seeds and then I could grow some tomatoes. I don't have to go to the hardware store and buy seeds, right? Like, libraries are so cool. Please go support your library. Go support your library. Anyway.
In the 80s, maybe find a copy of something that was created by a company that's now buried in 5 layers of corporate acquisition, right? And even from a corporate angle, a constant, if tiny, stream of like revenue from a library.
This is the original Pilot Wings on the SNES, and it is using the Super Effects chip to make those polygons. Look at these triangles, right? These triangles are not sprites; they're vector-based 3D polygons that are then, I believe, vertex shaded or something like that. Yeah, so that's 3D gaming on the Super Nintendo. It's done by the Super Effects chip, and this is on an emulator. This is on an emulator. So for those of you that are like, oh, emulation's illegal. No, it's not. No, it's not. If you have Nintendo Switch Online and you play a Super Nintendo game through Nintendo Switch Online on your Nintendo Switch, you're playing on an emulator. You're playing on an emulator. It's Nintendo's in-house produced emulator. They've been caught stealing open source emulators like SNES 9X and Dolphin. They've been Nestopia, I think it was, for the NES Virtual Console games on Nintendo Wii. They've been caught using emulators that they didn't entirely develop in-house, and they've been caught using ROMs, selling you ROMs that were acquired through ROM piracy websites, based off of the ROM dump information that is on there. It was dumped by somebody not at Nintendo. It's a whole thing. Nintendo sells you ROMs and they sell you emulators. They do it every day, and yet they're constantly trying to lie to you to trick you into thinking that emulation is illegal. This is literally an emulator right here. Oh no, Pilot Wing 64. I was wrong. This is not the Super Effects chip. This is on the Nintendo 64. Forget that I said that part. I retract it. This is literally in the bottom left corner, Pilot Wing 64. But this same kind of thing, this polygon-based stuff was done with the Super Effects chip. But with those polygons, notice how there's a texture on this mountainside. That should have been a dead giveaway to me. What the heck? This texture on the mountainside on this polygon, and you can even see one of the line splits right here for where it's a separate polygon. See, this is one polygon right here. Because there's a texture on it, you needed the Nintendo 64 to do that. The Super Nintendo, even with the FX chip, the Super FX chip, wasn't able to do textures or tile maps on top of their polygons that they rendered. Anyway, continuing on with the video.
Free royalties, that would probably, I mean, it's better than no money at all, and it's not a massive headache for you. And it's not like companies are above just grabbing an emulated version of the game and selling it back to you, because that's exactly what Nintendo did with Super Mario Brothers in 2017.
I was just talking about that.
People basically cracked it open. They're like, hey, this is just an emulator. And it's like,
yeah,
of course it's just an emulator.
Because emulators are really powerful. What it's doing is you know how VR is creating a digital world and presenting it to you as if it's like real, like a reality, virtual reality. An emulator is a way of, in software, recreating the hardware, right? So instructions that go to hardware that is not the same hardware that the software is running on, it's creating a virtual version, a fake version of that original hardware, which is why emulators are so cool. They're so cool because you never need to port a game. You never need to port a game again, ever. You can just have it run on an emulator. You don't even, you don't need to invest developer time into creating individual ports of individual games. You have them run on an emulator. And yeah, like, yes, it takes a lot of developer energy and it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort to create emulators for new hardware platforms, right? New instruction sets, the problems need to be solved. But right now, communities are already doing that for free. They're already doing it. There's people like Nintendo that come along and then take all of that hard work. They take it and then they sell it back to you, and they vilify, criminalize, and sue. They litigate the people that are actually working on this stuff that they're selling back to you. Kind of screwed up, kind of fucked up.
And this is where it gets sad, because the actual holdup here is, in a way, the ESA. Now, the ESA, they're an industry body. They, of course, are also the people who kept on failing at making E3 work recently. They've actually previously argued that if those groups wanted to do that, they could, but that they could not lend the media out or share it outside of the organization in any way.
Then what's the point? That's not open legal access anymore. So what's the point?
And the last round, unfortunately, of copyright review in the US went in their favor, which enshrined all of that.
Oh, no! GG's.
And the thing is, video games here are like the only medium.
Yes. That's like the point of this whole video, is that we've figured this out before. It's a solved problem. We're currently doing this with like all other forms of art. We know how to answer this question. Why is this still a question?
That are subject to this criteria. Other forms of art, like, you know, film, music, books, they don't have that.
You can go rent music from your library. You can go do that. You're not supposed to then put that CD into your computer and then download the music files from that CD and put them on your computer and then hold on to them after you give the CD back. You're not supposed to do that. But you totally could.
That for games, they do. It's like, have the commercial interests perhaps got in the way of something good here? I wonder.
I wonder too.
So basically, because of how they're treating this, anybody wanting to take advantage of a great game collection for, say, research purposes, they would have to go to the physical location of the collection and access the media there. They couldn't take it home with them. They couldn't, like, rent it out, borrow it out, anything like that. And that functionally makes these collections of video game history useless.
Yes, absolutely. Because the whole advantage of digital media is that it does not cost any physical resources to distribute that material. That's the magic of digital.
And all that does is, of course, point people towards emulation, which surely these
emulation and piracy. I think he means piracy, because emulation is a different thing.
Companies don't like, because they obviously look at emulation like, oh, they've pirated our game that we're not willing to sell to.
Right. So piracy, emulation, two different things, right? They're two different things. Emulation, totally legal. Look at Sony versus Bleem. Not a lawyer, don't hold myself out to be a lawyer, but I believe that's still good law. Bleem versus Sony. It was a early 2000s, late 90s case. Was this Bleem versus Sony? Bleem. PlayStation emulator designed to allow people to play original PlayStation games on their PC or Dreamcast gaming consoles. Wow. March 1999. Yo, right on the cusp. I nailed it. Bleem initially consisted of just 2 people. It only took 2 people to create an emulator. That's what's so cool about emulators, is that they're yes, like with all things, it takes effort and it takes energy and it takes skill to create these things. But look at how many developers it took to make it so that you can have access to your PlayStation games on non-PlayStation hardware. Right? That's cool. Like, imagine a world where you can buy a copy. Let's talk about physical copies right now. Let's talk about physical copies. You could buy a physical copy of a cartridge-based game. Let's see, what do I have right next to me? I have some physical cartridge-based games with me. Let's choose this one because it's probably worth some money or something, but I'm never going to sell it. Pokemon Moon. Oh, that's a lot of glare. Pokemon Moon, right? I have a physical copy of it right here. Right here. So I can buy this, but I need a Nintendo 3DS to play this game. This cartridge will outlive and will function for longer than this Nintendo 3DS. Oh, it needs to charge. Than this Nintendo 3DS. I'm gonna, my game saved. Let's make sure my game is saved. Don't mind me. Yep, good stuff. Okay, and turn it off. Okay. Oh, is it turning off? I hope it's turning off. Power off. Okay. I'll go charge this after stream. Please turn off. Sorry, the lights are still on. Oh, there we go. They just turned off. Okay. You need a Nintendo 3DS to be able to play this game, because it will only fit into, oh, you know what's even more money? Pokemon Soul Silver. Legit copy too. I have my Pokewalker. Yeah. Let's see, is it gonna show off? There you go. Little Togepi. Little Togepi action on the Pokewalker. Right. I have this game, but you need one of these to be able to play it. The problem with that is that this has very little thing. There's very few pieces of this that are going to break over time. And when I say over time, I mean over the next 50 to 200 years, right? Almost every atom has a half-life, and time is cruel. The plastic will eventually break down, right? It'll take a couple thousand years, but eventually even the plastic will break down on these things. So eventually it will not be a thing that you can use anymore. But this has things like capacitors and LCD screens and rubber things on it, and the rubber's going to break down, especially because skin oils are in contact with it, and that's going to break it down. So this device that is necessary to access these digital files will break before these do. An emulator, if I have, let's say, an emulator like Desmume. Yeah, look at that. Look at that. Right? So, got my copy here. We've got it. We've got the device to play it on. Let's say this thing breaks. This thing gets stolen. Still have that. Oh, sorry about that. That was loud. Got this guy. I can still play it. Right? So, emulators are so powerful because they surpass the need for the hardware. Because this hardware is not being manufactured anymore. It's not being created. There's a finite number on this planet. And because of things like intellectual property law, no other companies are allowed to make them, even though Nintendo isn't doing that anymore. So there will come a day when there are no more DSs to play Pokemon Soul Silver on. The day will come. But with the power of an emulator, we're still able to access and use that software without having to port it. Because with a port, things will change. It must be modified. It is an interpretation of that original software. Things like performance will change, the way that things are even rendered, especially when it comes to tile and sprite-based systems, right? The difference between the Sega version of a game and the Nintendo version of a game, they're going to be a little different, because porting, it makes the software different. Emulation isn't a port. it's a way of running the software as originally intended on hardware that it's not intended for. It's really powerful. And by being allowed to loan out digital versions of these games and running them on an emulator, you can run it as originally intended. You can increase the resolution. You can increase the speed that the game runs at. You can increase the frame rate. You can do things. There was a really important one that I wanted to talk about. It's completely gone now. Hardware limitations, like on the NES, if there were too many sprites on a single line, the sprites would flicker. It was a hardware limitation because there were too many sprites on a line, and the CPU like literally could not handle that many sprites on a line, and so they would flicker. They would take turns being a sprite on a screen for each time that the screen refreshed. So you get the sprite flicker. In an emulator, you can turn off things like sprite flicker. Now, sometimes developers would use hardware limitations to create art around it, so you don't want to mess with those hardware limitations. But other times, it's a hardware limitation, and we can move beyond that. So let's do that. And when you're engaging with these in an academic way, having the ability to do all those things is really important. So this is counterproductive to the purpose of having these libraries. A, because it's not actually access if you physically have to be there. And B, that you don't have the full ability to interact with the medium in all of the ways that are technologically possible today. Artificially being limited by the ESA.
Anybody. How dare they? So there's a distinction, I think, between making something available and making something approachable. It's like
that is a really good point. That is a really good point, and I really like the language he's using there. Yeah, because making something available means that technically there is a way for you to access it, right? You just have to travel to this city, travel to this town, and do the thing there during the business hours that they're operating in. Technically, that's available, but it's not approachable. And I would argue that in the spirit of what the word available means, it is not effectively available. It is technically available. I know that doesn't, like, that kind of philosophical thing, like that doesn't really hold up in a court of law. You need to be able to distinguish between words like available and approachable and that kind of stuff. But I think that when we're talking about like the emotional weight of something, right, and we're having this discussion about the morality of something or how something ought to be, right, that distinguishing between available and approachable, like really it's the difference between technically available and functionally available, right?
Like, yeah, you've ticked the box, but in a way that doesn't really, like, fill the spirit of that. So it is just like what Gabe said.
Whoa! It doesn't fill the spirit of it. Yo! Great minds, great minds.
You know, piracy is a service problem.
Truth bombs. Piracy is a service problem. Absolutely.
Emulation is a service problem. People.
Piracy. That I like to say that goes hand in hand with piracy because I have a modded. I've put custom firmware on this 3DS, a legal thing to do, even though Nintendo tries to do updates for no reason other than breaking modified firmware. I am able to put that game cartridge into my DS and pull the game files off of it, put them onto the SD card, and then either through a transfer protocol called FTP, File Transfer Protocol, which is device to device, and it uses things like the internet. It's a peer-to-peer file transfer, so it doesn't have to go to a server and then come back down to me. Like with Steam, when you download a game off of Steam, you are accessing Steam's servers to get a copy of those files. FTP is a way for you to share a file with somebody else directly, your computer connecting to their computer. When you put something on like a Google Drive or a Dropbox or a OneDrive, you're sending your information to another company's server or another machine, and then the person that you're sharing it with is then accessing that machine and getting it off of that machine, right? So I can put the SD card into my computer, or I can do an FTP file transfer from the 3DS to my computer, and that's how I got that Soul Silver ROM. Is I ripped it myself. It's totally possible. The issue and its broad approachability, the spirit of availability, is that I have access to this device, which means I can rip those things, but I can't hand this to my friend. I can't hand this to my neighbor and have them do the same thing, and we each have legal copies. It's only my legal copy as long as I still have my cartridge with me. As soon as I no longer have possession of that cartridge, that copy I'm not legally entitled to have a copy of. Even though that's the promise of digital, that's the magic of digital, right? That's the whole point.
People are emulating, fiddling around with DOS boxes and all that stuff, because fundamentally
DOS box is way cool for all those early Microsoft DOS games. It is an emulator from Microsoft DOS, which is kind of the underlying foundation of the Windows operating system, but not really anymore. Complicated history.
You just can't access the games that they're actually interested in playing because they have fallen into a weird black hole void where these companies
go for a really good example of a DOS game. Go watch Game Grumps. Danny plays a few DOS based games. It's the point and click adventures. What are those? Shot of the Claws, Leisure Suit Larry, King's Quest. That's a Sierra game. King's Quest. You're not going to show me pictures. King's Quest. I don't want a full walkthrough. Here you go. This is a DOS game. Which is playable via things like DOSBox, which you can just do on an internet browser. You don't even need to run the emulator program locally on your machine. Really cool stuff.
Simultaneously refuse to sell you the game or get the game into a shippable state, but also, technically refuse any other way for you to get it. So you just end up being screwed. And then, of course, you're forced to emulate. So I think that this, from the Video Game History Foundation, is just a massive rebuke of the status quo. It's saying, listen, everybody, look at this graph. How is it that from...
Absolutely. This is such an important report. Because it is distinct, it is concrete, and it is to the point that these games are not available. They're not approachable. People cannot play them. And if people cannot play them, that is a problem.
1995 to like 2004, we have less games preservation than from 1990 to 1994. How is this getting worse? And I think it's important that they're doing that, they're putting the effort into that. Again, think about, a movie like The Exorcist or The Shining or like Vertigo or The God,
The Birds, Alfred Hitchcock,
or just a lot of those.
Charlie Chaplin movies. Those things actually still kind of slap. Like if you can get a hold of a Charlie Chaplin movie, give it a watch. Like invite some friends over, cook some popcorn, have some pizza, and watch a Charlie Chaplin movie. Those things still slap. It's actually kind of crazy.
I mean, older films like you can access,
The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Let's talk about the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson. When did those come out? 2001. That's over 20 years ago. That's within the timeline that we're talking about with these lost video games, right? We're talking about things that came out at the same time as The Lord of the Rings. 2001, that's when Majora's Mask came out. 2000, came out in 2000. Majora's Mask is one of the most loved Zelda titles because it's like dark and fun and edgy, right? Really amazing game. There is no legal way for you, the viewer, to go out and acquire this game that gives Nintendo money. You can play it through Nintendo Switch Online, but that's a subscription service. As soon as you stop paying your monthly fee for Nintendo Switch Online, you lose access to this game. That is not, if that's the only way of accessing something, that's not access. That's not access. The only way to get a copy of this game is on the secondhand market. Nintendo gets $0 from secondhand market sales. Give me 1 second. My childhood copies. My childhood copies of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. My childhood copies. I have a Nintendo 64 back there. This is, let's see, as we're seeing on eBay, let's look at sold. A lot of 3DS. A lot of 3DS. I have that digital on my 3DS. $50? $50. There's no way for you to get this game, to have it, without, while giving Nintendo money, right? But if you wanted to buy The Lord of the Rings, bada bing, bada boom, sold new on Amazon. Who published that movie? Yeah, so New Line Cinema and the Tolkien estate is going to get money from that sale, which, when we're talking about access to these things, when we're talking about access and we're talking about, you know, what legally needs to be happening there, we're talking about profit. We're talking about where the money goes, right? Because when you buy something from Nintendo, they are getting money for the labor of the employees that created that thing, right? So when we're talking about access and what's legally, like, you know, all the legal red tape, all the hoops you have to jump through, it's about making sure that the people who hold the intellectual property and hold the copyright are getting the money that they are due. So there is no way for you to get access to Majora's Mask to get a copy of the game that gives Nintendo money, other than through Nintendo Switch Online, which, as I just mentioned, if the only way to access something is through a subscription, you do not have access to it because you do not have control over it, right? Because they can pull that down at any time. Just look at the streaming services that did that, right? Mysterious Benedict Society, that one Harley Quinn show, you know, Over the Garden Wall, like all these things, right? But you can still purchase most of those things that are not on the streaming services only. That's why it was such a big deal when HBO and Disney took down a lot of those things, because there's no way for you to buy a DVD of it. It's not airing on cable, which I don't actually consider to be like ownership and access, right? The point that I'm trying to make is that there's no difference to Nintendo today if you buy a 3DS cartridge and rip that version of Majora's Mask onto your 3DS and then put that ROM onto your computer and then play that ROM on a Citra emulator or whatever, right? Because you know what I could do is that my friends or my neighbors, if they own 3DS games, I could lend them my 3DS to rip the files to put onto their computer. And then as long as they maintain access to that cartridge, they are allowed to play that game, right? None of that is illegal. What is illegal is the distribution of the files. So I have a physical copy of Majora's Mask. I don't have the hardware to rip the ROM off of this, the game file, and put it on my computer, so I can't play it on a Nintendo 64 emulator. Because the only way for me to get a ROM is to have it distributed to me via somebody else from digital format, staying through digital format, right? That's what's illegal. That's piracy. So, like, this is the problem that we're talking about. Okay, we're running out of time. I gotta try and finish this up. But that's That's the thing we're talking about, right? Is that there's all these hoops. There's no way for you to get a copy of this so that you can get a ROM onto your computer that gives Nintendo a penny. But they make sure that it's illegal for you to do that.
It's like you can't really do the video game version of that. And that just sucks, right? And I think the real reason why we've got to be aware of this is because next year the DMCA review comes in, and that's where the ESA are going to be gearing up to defend the status quo. So that bad graph that we all saw, bad numbers are awful. That's what the ESA are going to be defending, right?
Yep.
And they've already begun to downplay that because their president, Stanley Pierre-Louis, said to Game Developer, quote, "I don't know that I agree with the results of the Video Game History Foundation study or how they're characterizing it. There's a robust avenue for preservation to occur, and that is occurring." It's like, right, that's your own definition of robust and occurring. And also, how about you look at the numbers?
Screw off.
Look at how the numbers are low. I mean, surely as somebody working in the ESA, where you're basically existing, you know, the line must go up, right? Line go up for the...
Line go up, baby. Everyone worship. Everyone all hail the almighty line and how it must go up.
Line god in the stock market. Surely then he must be able to understand a line going down and perhaps be alarmed by it. And to end with a quote from Brandon Butler of the University of Virginia Library and Software Preservation Network, I think just the choice part is, the market will not preserve our history.
Plain and simple, the market will not preserve our history. There's no profit incentive. The market will not preserve our history.
That's not the market's job.
Exactly. It's not the market's job. The market's job is to generate profit.
And I think that's really the thing. Where does a market solution...
If you want a source for that, look up Dodge versus Ford, as in the Dodge brothers versus Henry Ford. Look up Ford. Was it Ford versus Dodge? Yeah, Dodge versus Ford Motor Company. 1919. That's the basis of it.
Solution makes sense. And many people would say, actually, for most things, a market-based solution does make sense. But I think, you know, when you then go and think about...
That's their opinion, arguable anyway.
Like some other things, it's like, all right, maybe this isn't what the market is as well calibrated to do.
It's not.
Therefore, like how there are like government-funded bodies that are involved in the preservation of music and various other things like that. Why do we not have that for our medium? And why
absolutely
are advocates for the companies who make games, why are they lobbying against basically the interests of the art form? Because I think we're really getting to a point now where there's a big difference between the interests of the companies making these games and then the interests of the art form itself. And I think we've really forgotten the latter quite a lot indeed. I mean, is it any wonder we've forgotten the latter when so much of the discussion is destroyed by like monetization and all of these things that are like secondary to the art but kind of ruin it and mess it up. It's not like the old pure times of, yeah, here's my ticket, let me see the movie. And the
absolutely, here's my ticket, let me see the movie.
Movie itself just gets to be in movie, you know, unruined. Of course, whenever the financial interests get overly weird and controlling with a movie, what do you get? Well, we get that era where randomly all the big Western movies also shoehorned in a whole bunch of China stuff, where you're just like, hey, I've absolutely no problem with a movie being set in China, but the way you're doing this just feels really contrived.
The reason that was happening is because the Chinese market was opened to Western media. And so to appeal to Chinese audiences, everything was set in or had a link to China to be able to try to pull the Chinese market in, because they're a huge population, and a huge population means a lot of wallets to try to get access to. It's a whole thing.
As if it's for some external reason, and that makes the movie less good. In the same way that fucked about with our movies for a bit, this is fucking about with our games. And you know what? I don't like our games being fucked about with. And that is it.
Amen.
For today's video. Let me know what you think. Do you have old games? One of the things that I like, you know, whenever I walk through, say, QCon, it's a gaming and anime con that happens here in Belfast, or others, is you see like the kind of like wheeler dealers of the old retro games, right? Like I always think it's cool to see that, cool to see the retro stand. So what retro games do you have?
This isn't even the full library. I showed you guys a good chunk of what I have, right? And it's super cool that I still have these things, right? Let's finish up the video before I dive into that.
A bit of a late bloomer in games. My first console was a PS2.
Mine was a Super Nintendo. A Super Nintendo.
Boy Advance before that. But yeah, it does mean that older era of games, unless it's on PC, I don't really know too much about it. Anyway, let me know. See you next time.
Awesome stuff. Drop it a like. Please, if you're seeing this from my channel and you're not already like aware of Bellular News, go check them out. They're freaking awesome. I know that I'm very curated with my subscribe list, so I'm not going to show the whole like, oh, like, subscribe, all the stuff. But like, especially because we're watching it here, if you can at least go by and drop it a like, that's a really big deal. I'm not trying to just like mooch off their content. I feel like I'm being transformative here. Anyway, let's let him finish his last ideas. Oh, see you next time. He already said the thing. Fantastic. We're just gonna hop over here. Okay. Awesome. Let's try to wrap that up. I got stuff to get to. Margot's gonna be home soon. So yeah, old video games, access to them. I know that he left it with a, what is your retro gaming collection? I have a massive retro gaming collection. At least compared to most people. I'm not a collector. I'm not trying to complete a collection. Ooh, give me one more second. I do have one more thing I want to show you guys. Yeah, retro gaming collection, right? So I've got, oh boy, let's try and, oh. So we got some Xbox 360 games. Oh, yeah, here we go. Right? Oh, the whole Halo collection. That's a good collection right there. Double disc for Halo 4. This is very difficult. Yeah, there we go. Uh-oh. Ooh, more Xbox 360. Leave a little space just in case the collection grows. Now we got some GameCube games. That's a Zelda Collector's Edition right there. Oh, Double Dash, Paper Mario. Whatever lives there is inside the GameCube and or Wii right now. Star Fox Adventures, Smash Bros. Brawl, blah, 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 blah. Got some Wii games. Oh, yeah, Skyward Sword. 2 copies of Link's Crossbow Training, and then my dad got Madden 2008. Shout out to any Scott the Woz fans. Got Madden 2008. The back of that collection. So that's like, these are all my childhood games. Oh, those are all my childhood games for the consoles that I had. And then we got access to the treasure trove. We have a working Game Boy Color, bunch of Game Boy Color games. One of the money makers, we got a Pokemon Emerald, Sans label. You know, we just got a lot of cool stuff. So this is my, that's a portion of my retro gaming collection, right? And I'm very fortunate that I still have it. The reason we lost a lot of our Wii games is because our Wii's disk drive broke. Back in like 2011 or something like that. The disk drive broke, but it was a still functioning Wii. So we, you know, we hacked it and we did an external USB hard drive for all of our games. And we had our friends rip all of our games onto the hard drive. And then we plugged the hard drive into the Wii and we played all of our games through that. And it was really awesome. That was how we did our library. And then, because we could use the cash to maybe buy a new Xbox 360 game or another Wiimote and Nunchuck so that more people could play. We sold our Wii games to you know, get access to newer games. And that's a big bummer because I don't have access to those anymore. And yes, that was technically like illegal. We didn't have access to those original copies anymore. So the digital copies that we had that we were holding on to, kind of a legal gray area, right? Um, but I'm super, super lucky. Also, I didn't buy these Nintendo 64 games. My family didn't buy these Nintendo 64 games when we were a kid. We got them from the family that that let us have the Nintendo 64. Those were their games. They moved on to the next console. And so now I have them still. We never sold them, and I'm not going to sell them. They're my games. They're my childhood games. They have my childhood saves on them, some of them. And that's a big deal. And I know that not everyone has that luxury, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have access to those games. We talked about libraries for a hot second. Margot and I, my partner, we're currently listening to the Lord of the Rings on tape through the library. Even though we don't own those books, we don't own that book on tape. Because of the library, we're able to access that, and that's important. That's important. It's so important that that we agreed to fund those things through our government. We all agreed that it's a good thing for all of us to pay for, like roads and fire departments and policemen for whatever reason. Like, it's so important, and we already came to that answer. It's really horrible, greedy groups like the ESA and lobbyists that are ruining it. And that's not normal. That's not how it is for any other medium, and it's not how it has been. Don't let them fool you into thinking that what is right is radical. They're the ones trying to make changes, and they're trying to change it for the worse. Anyway, I think that's where we're going to end it. I guess I'll throw in my own little call to action. I'd love to hear if anybody else has lost access to their childhood games. And how often do you think about that? How often it comes up? Let me know if you're a modern gamer, like Steam and stuff like that. Just dude, talk about cool stuff. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging out. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.